So now we're going to study a poem for your language paper 2, and this is Robert Frost's poem Out, Out. So take out your anthologies now and get ready to highlight and annotate as we go through the poem, and pause the video whenever you need to. So this poem was written during the First World War in America in 1916, and it was inspired by a movement which was trying to raise people's awareness of the suffering of children who were being made to work. Child labour was still quite prevalent at the turn of the 20th century in America. And there was a photographer from New York City, he was also a school teacher, called Lewis Hine, and he believed that a picture could tell a powerful story. And so he went round with his camera and captured lots of pictures of children working. And you can see in the right-hand corner here, this very young boy, probably about 6 or 7 years old, who's working at a circular saw. And you can see the circular saw turning in the background. And Lewis Hine felt so strongly about the abuse of children as workers that he quit his teaching job and became an investigative photographer for the National Child Labour Committee. And Hine believed that if people could see for themselves the abuses and injustices of child labour, they would demand laws against these evils and to end child labour. Now, Robert Frost tries to capture a moment from child labour in his poem Out, Out. And he uses words where Lewis Hine used the camera. And Lewis Hine said, if I could tell the story in words, I wouldn't need to lug around a camera. And this is exactly then what inspires Robert Frost. So as we read the poem, think about how effectively Robert Frost conveys what Hines tried to convey in photographs. That is, the cruelty, the experience of children having to work at a very young age. But the poem could also be showing us other ideas and questions about life. So tell me at the end, and make a note of what other themes the poem might be exploring.
The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood, sweet-scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. And from there those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset far into Vermont.
So the poem appears on the page in one long block of 34 lines, and it's written in a particular form. I wonder if you can tell what it is. If you count the number of syllables in each line, tell me how many there are. Well, let's pause the video and count them. Yes, so you guessed it. It's written in a pentameter. That means that there are 10 syllables in each line, and normally there would be 5 stressed syllables amongst the 10. So almost every line is written in pentameter, but except for one. So, look out for the one that isn't. And we also notice then in these first few lines, the first 6 lines of the poem here, we have 2 sentences which are setting the scene, and we begin with the noise, the noise and the personification of the saw. The buzzsaw snarled and rattled. So notice that we have there, it's not a personification, it's almost a zoomorphism. That means that we're transforming something inanimate into an animal, zoomorphism. When we use the word snarl, which is usually used for a dog snarling. and the rattling is onomatopoeia, which really creates that, sets the scene there with the noise of that machine. It's really loud, and we're in the yard, so we have the setting, and we have all the atmosphere with the dust and all the dropped wood around. It's quite a chaotic scene that we're thrown into at the start. And the stuff which is sweet scented on the breeze, and then we're invited to lift our eyes to a sunset which shows us where we are in the countryside in Vermont with the mountain ranges behind. So the first 6 lines really set the scene, but there's no human presence yet described in the first 6 lines.
And the saw snarled and rattled as it ran light or had to bear a load, and nothing happened. Day was all but done. Call it a day, I wish they might have said, to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work.
So in the next 6 lines, we have a repetition of the noises made by this circular saw once again. The saw snarled and rattled, snarled and rattled. So the repetition of those words reflects the repetitive movement of the circular saw as it ran light or had to bear a load. And then we have an interesting use of the punctuation with the colon after "and nothing happened," and that makes us pause. Day was all but done. It's a strange thing to note that nothing happened. That creates suspense, as does the caesura. We're told that it's the end of the day. The day was all but done. It's almost time to stop work. Call it a day. That's colloquial language. It's familiar language, meaning, it's time to have a rest. I wish they might have said to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. Now, the repetition of boy here introduces the human element, and it's emphasized that this is a young child. And with this whimsical wish, there's an introduction again of a foreboding tone. I wish that they would have asked him to leave earlier before he got so tired and the terrible thing that's about to happen happens to him. So the repetition of boy there, you should annotate the use of the caesura and colloquial language, and also the tone that's introduced with the words wish and might, which introduces regret and therefore foreboding.
His sister stood beside him in her apron to tell them supper. At the word, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leapt out at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. However it was, neither refused the meeting. But the hand.
And in the next 6 lines, we have an introduction of another human being, the sister of the young boy. So she herself must be quite young, and she's calling him to supper, tell them supper. And then we have another caesura after the word supper. At the word, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leapt out of the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. So this personification or zoomorphism of the saw really comes into life now with this ominous movement and violent movement of the saw out of the boy's hand. And then we have a dash. Notice the punctuation. And he must have given the hand. This is surmise, we're trying to understand what has happened. He must have. And then another pause, caesura, after the word hand. And that's really important because it is the hand that we're focusing on. However it was, neither refused the meeting, neither refers to the hand and the saw, and this euphemism for meeting, of the word meeting, which actually stands for the violent, the thing that happens to the hand, the severing, and the caesura, but the hand with the exclamation mark really brings everything to a climax. And the words however and but, creating at once doubt and shock.
The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know, big boy doing man's work, though a child at heart. He saw all spoiled. Don't let him cut my hand off. The doctor, when he comes, don't let him, sister.
And in this part of the poem, we have another sound other than the saw, and that is the boy's first outcry, which is a laugh, a rueful laugh. And so, the holding up his hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. And this repetition of half is very striking there, and it makes us think about a cutting in half. This verb spilling as well, which is a metaphor for, it's the blood that's spilling, but it's his life pouring out of him. And we have also a pun, a play on words, when we see the boy saw all, and the word saw is repeated again. He saw all spoiled a bit later on. And this repetition of saw right next to the boy shows how there's been this violent contact between them. And it's all understatement, and there's nothing kind of horrific in our face, it's just understated. And then we hear more sounds, and that's the voice of the boy himself with direct speech. Don't let him cut my hand off. The doctor, when he comes, don't let him, sister. And with this appeal and this exclamation mark, where we realize that the wound is very serious and may turn gangrenous and need an amputation.
So, but the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath, and then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart, little, less, nothing, and that ended it. No more to build on there, and they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs.
This part of the poem just has one word at the start of the sentence, followed by this full stop, this pause. So. It's very matter of fact, and then followed by but the hand was gone already. So the boy's fears of amputation really are meaningless, because we're now told starkly that the hand has been cut off. It's very matter of fact. The words are monosyllabic almost, and very simple, and that, in a way, that understatement makes it even more horrific. We see the action of the doctor putting the boy to sleep with ether. That's the anesthetic that was used in those days. And the boy then, we're shown him lying and puffing his lips out with his breath, showing that he's really nearing the end here. And then notice the dashes before the watcher at his pulse took fright. The watcher is the doctor, and realizing that his pulse is fading here, and the doctor takes fright. Again, the caesura in the middle of the line, no one believed, pause. we are like the onlookers here. We can't quite believe what's happened. They listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing. Notice the gradation there with the dashes showing his life petering out. And that ended it. A very, very brutal phrase, and that ended it, very stark. No more to build on there. Interesting the use of the word build. If this is child labour, the child's life no longer useful because he can't work. He's dead. Again a caesura and a pause. And they, beginning with this and, as if in mid-sentence, the people continue. This mid-sentence shows that with the enjambment, since they were not the one dead, showing that continuity, they turn to their affairs. So life has to go on. The people have to continue working. It shows their indifference, perhaps, but it could also be interpreted not that they are indifferent, but that they have no choice. They're so poor, these people. That's why their children are working, because they're so desperate. They need this money. This is before the welfare state, remember. And so people are forced into this position of making their children work alongside them. So that's it for my talking through the analysis. So the title Out, you must have spotted it already. This is of course an allusion to Macbeth in Act 5, when Macbeth learns of Lady Macbeth's suicide. And he says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have delighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, this is a very bitter speech, and you can watch on the video. A great actor will perform it much better than me. So now taking notes on the form, the structure and the pace of the poem, and how this works to create an effect, an impact on the reader. So we've noticed the pentameter, the use of the 10 syllables per line. Did you notice which line didn't conform to this pentameter? Well, we'll come to that in a moment. So the pentameter is used by Shakespeare, as you know from your study of Macbeth, and it's used for speaking of noble subjects. So Robert Frost has chosen, even though he's depicting working people, people of a low status, he decides to take Shakespeare's pentameter use for noble subjects. The pentameter is also something that reflects the heartbeat of everyday breathing and calm breath. This is what gives it its nobility, if you like. The regular heartbeat, the calmness of it, which adds to the understatement. Now, the only line that didn't conform to the pentameter is that line where we see what has really happened. In line 27, so, but the hand was gone already. So that only has 9 syllables there, and it makes that line really stand out. The shock of it. Then we have the use of enjambment in the poem, which increases the pace. Most of the enjambments happen in the middle of the poem, although there's also an awful lot of end-stopped lines, an awful lot of punctuation at the end of the line, which makes us stop and pause at the end. And we notice that particularly after that line 27, when almost every line ends in a full stop. And that makes us pause and really brings home the solemnity of the moment that this child has lost his life. There are also many caesuras that we've noticed which make us pause in the middle of a line, breaking up the rhythm and increasing the tension. These are dramatic pauses which create suspense and make us hold our breath. Noticed that the tone and the diction and the imagery all add to the poem's effect, its impact. We notice that the tone is understated, increasing the pathos more effectively, that the boy's direct speech makes us experience the event more closely, as if he is appealing to us, the reader, directly. And the diction, we've noticed some of it is quite colloquial and everyday language, emphasizing that this is an ordinary boy in an ordinary community, and that this may even be quite a common event, which is a horrific thought. And the imagery, well, the Thor, of course, is either personified or zoomorphized, and although it starts off being almost comical, like a child's innocent perception of the Thor, this contrasts starkly with the mortal danger and, in fact, the death which it causes. The Thor is, of course, a machine. It's indifferent to humans and human suffering. So perhaps it also functions as a metaphor for the indifference of the world to the individual pain of this child, and the indifference of the world to the suffering of all those children drafted into child labour. So work itself is symbolized. The dignity of the boy and his innocence are shown in this poem. The community, at the end of the poem, they react to this terrible death with, as we said, little emotion. Ask yourself why that might be and make a note of that. So, as I mentioned at the start, the poem was written in 1916 in the middle of the First World War. So when we learn that the boy is doing man's work in the poem, we might think it's because the men had gone off to fight, but America didn't enter the First World War until 1917. So it's clear that the poem is really showing us the state of affairs, that children are being used to work for no real reason other than that they might be cheap labor and exploited. People lived harsh lives in America without a welfare state. In rural America, particularly in the agricultural areas, as you know from your study of mice and men. And they were used to life being cheap, used to death, and they seem to accept it at the end of the poem as part of life.
Robert Frost himself, well, he was born in San Francisco, California in 1874. He was the son of a teacher and of a Scotswoman. He moved to New England when his father died of tuberculosis in 1885, when he was just 11 years old. His mother died of cancer in 1900 when Frost was 26. Depression and mental illness plagued his family. Frost's sister Jeannie in 1920 and his daughter Irma in 1947 were both committed to mental hospitals, and Frost and his wife both suffered from depression. Taking over the family farm as a young man was not a great success, and Frost became an English teacher in the early 1900s in New Hampshire. Following the deaths of their first two children, the Frosts moved to Beaconsfield, England in 1912, and it was here that he published his first poetry collection, A Boy's Will, in 1913. But on the outbreak of war, the Frosts returned to America in 1915, where they bought a farm in New Hampshire, and his career as a writer and lecturer and teacher was launched. Of his 6 children, 4 died before him. Elliot, aged 8 in 1904, Eleanor, who died a baby a few days old in 1907, Marjorie, who died in childbirth at the age of 29 in 1934, and his son Carol, who committed suicide aged 38 in 1940. His wife Eleanor died in 1938 of breast cancer and heart failure. Frost died in 1963, living to a ripe old age of 88 in Boston, Massachusetts. But you can see how this list of suffering and death and loss may have affected the writer of this poem, Out. This idea of the brevity of life, the indifference of the universe to human suffering.
So now that you've listened to this video on the poem, you can turn to the worksheet that you were given in class and you can answer the questions on the worksheet. You have to annotate the poem, summarize the narrative, that's the story of what happens in your own words, and that would be useful for an introduction to an essay. And then you're asked to find examples of the poetic devices in the poem, but also, most importantly, to describe their effect on the reader. And so there will be an essay in class on this poem. So make sure that you use all the resources that I've put available for you on Schoology. And you can see on the next two slides, there are some annotations that you could work with as well.